it's time for the book of Jacques Roskilly. I hope you hear me all of you. Yes. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I am Marina Loukaki, and I am teaching Byzantine literature at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Athens. And I am very happy to accept the invitation and to be able to introduce a new scholar who is dynamically entering the scholarly community of the Byzantinists with a very interesting book. This is Jacques Roskilly, and for those who don't know him, Jacques has studied history at the Paris Sorbonne University, from which he was awarded a doctorate in 217. From this date to 221, he served as attaché temporaire d'enseignement et de recherche at the Jules Verne University in Amiens, and now he is a professor agrégé of history and geography in secondary education at the Descartes Museum. He is a member of the French Committee of Byzantine Studies and a member of the Society of Medieval Historians of Public Higher Education. And his scholarly interests focus on social history and the history of ideas and conceptions of power in Byzantium. Let me mention his recent article in Byzantium, volume 90, 220, as an example. The title is L'Empereur, l'aristocrate et l'évêque, autorité sur l'État et relations de pouvoir dans le discours de Michel Choniates. In his doctoral thesis, which he prepared under the supervision of Professor Michel Kaplan, he bears the title Logiotati Pimenes, les évêques et leur autorité dans la société byzantine des XIe et XIIe siècles. He deals with the highly interesting topic of the participation of metropolitans and bishops in the life of Byzantine society during the 11th and 12th centuries. The author seeks to specify and determine the critical features which compose the profile of ecclesiastical leaders in this period and shape the model of their authority and the methods of exercising it. He studies the role played by the bishops in local societies under their jurisdiction, their relations with the central church administration, and their presence in the capital, mostly in the light of a historical sociological perspective. The published version of this doctoral thesis is the book presented to us today, which bears the slightly modified title de Très, savants, pasteurs, conception et pratique de l'autorité des évêques dans la société byzantine. This book, the XIe-XIIe siècle. It was published in Paris in 222 as number 32 of the series Byzantina Sorbonensia. And I went through it with great interest, and I have already written an extensive review about it in Byzantina Simicta of this year. But now I think it is better to pass the word to Jacques himself. He will talk about his work, his scholarly considerations, and his conclusions. Jacques, you have the word. I think we don't hear you. Petros, could you
Hello, Zach. No, it's an issue with your microphone, clearly, because you are not muted. So I think it's an issue with your computer. Can you try to test your microphone?
Is it okay?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. So sorry for the microphone problems. Firstly, I thank very much Professor Loukaki for accepting to present today my book. So as she said, it was based on my PhD begun in 2013 and defended in 2017. So back to the origins, this PhD was supposed to be a monograph on Byzantine bishops in the 11th and 12th centuries. But my work wasn't supposed to be revolutionary. It was supposed to be a simple monograph. But I guess I tried to make some findings I didn't expect to at the beginning, which is, I guess, the work of an historian. So my main methods at the beginning of my research was to make a prosopography of the bishops, considering that the prosopographical tools for the period were not complete 10 years ago. So I found many biographical evidences on bishops in the main sources of the period, like the seals, the letters, the rhetorical texts, the narratives, and the synodal decrees. And for the publication, I kept only the bishops on which I had at least one significant information in my prosopography published in the annex of the book, like the surname, an office occupied before his chrismation, or if he was a former monk, and so on. But as I was reading my sources, primarily the rhetorical texts from bishops or future bishops, like praises, monodial, so on, I realized I thought what I thought was the main transformation of the bishopric authority in this period. That is what I called in my book the intellectual model of bishopric authority. This model originated in the career of bishops before their chrismation. Most of them, including metropolitan bishops or simple bishops, were educated in the Constantinopolitan schools, achieved a high education degree, and were integrated in the intellectual circles of the capital. This led bishops in their praises or monodia to other bishops to depict them mainly as intellectuals, learned in classical and theological culture, and using it as a rhetorical tool or government tool. Praises delivered to the aristocrats, emperors, or patriarchs were essential to advance their career, as bishops came from the second rank aristocracy. That is, in the communion system, the aristocrats who did not belong to the imperial kinship. Praises described bishops in their office also as rhetoricians and teachers to their folk, leading their magisterium and becoming the last cultural light in a barbarian and uneducated land. So I identified this intellectual model of authority as a form of charisma in the sense of Max Weber. This form of authority is an individual capacity recognized as exceptional by others through the lens of rhetoric, which gives bishops a superiority over their folk and sometimes over aristocrats or emperors. However, Max Weber formulated his theory of charisma as opposed to other forms of authority, especially what he called the traditional one or the bureaucratic one. But and charisma in the Weberian theory appears in a period of crisis when an individual challenged the institutions. So I tried to define a form of charisma combined with an institutional and traditional authority, that is the traditional authority of bishops given through the church and the chrismation. So I argue in my book that this form of authority generalized for bishops in the 12th century and gave them specific ways to apply their power in the Byzantine Empire and society, which is the main topic of the second part of my book. So firstly, in this second part, I try to argue that the Constantinopolitan background of bishops and the territorial losses of the empire in the end of the 11th century doesn't withdraw the bishops from their dioceses and pastoral duties. On the contrary, they were still present in the provinces, in their dioceses, and they took their duties seriously, particularly concerning the matters of ecclesiastical properties. Secondly, the key of good administration relied on their networks, which can be traced through the letters collections, the exchange of gifts, praises, and services between well-educated bishops and aristocrats. The network of Theophylact of Bulgaria was already studied by Margaret Mullet, a very clear study, but I extend her work by applying the social network analysis to the letter collection of Michael Koniatis. So I made a diachronic studies of his network, which led me conclude that the network of a bishop is always centered on the capital and privileged the contact with the emperor and courtiers that could grant him privileges for his diocese and his folk. So, however, bishops' networks were never connected directly to the emperor, but must gain influence on him through the mediation of the aristocrats living in the capital. This conclusion is quite relevant with the social background of many bishops. So in the Comnenian system, second-rank aristocrats had less power and influence that the Comnenian extended kingship. And my last chapter demonstrates that bishops had very little implication in the political crisis of the empire and were barely implied in them and in the coup which could driven out emperors in the course of the 11th and 12th centuries. So I wrote also some chapters on the permanent synod in this period and the role of the bishops in the formulation of the ecclesiastical law. But I think I must stop here and open the discussion now. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I am ready to answer the questions.